the 39th episode of Unifying Force. I'm Kat, joined by Dave and Gio. How is everybody?
That's a
Good, thanks.
lovely rainy day today.
We've had nothing but rain and hail and atmospheric rivers for the last month, and now it's finally starting to get sunny again.
Right.
Floods.
Yeah.
I know there's been a lot of damage and bad things going on in that neck of the woods.
How about you, Gio?
Yeah, here it's just been pretty brisk, very icy, and sub-zero temperatures. Nothing in terms of serious snowstorm. But yeah, it is that time of year, right? It's January and it's to be expected, but sometimes it still catches some people off guard a little. Especially I find black ice, the kind that you don't really see, but can slick right under you.
So today we're talking about if sci-fi fantasy genre dead and how that relates to Star Wars. Dave, why don't you lead us off?
So what I'm saying, what I postulate on this is, yes, there's different kinds of like science-based movie genres. We've got obviously your science fiction, science fantasy. Geo mentioned earlier off cameras like the space opera. But I think at least originally Star Wars was labeled as a science fantasy. Yes, it has science fictiony, wild, outlandish things that we don't have in our technology, but that's how it was labeled. And is that genre, is it going away? Is it gone? I think I've got my opinions on it, which is I think it's going. I think it's dying out. We haven't seen movies that do well, that are super popular in that specific Star Wars genre, with some exceptions I'll talk about. I can hear people in the background going, wait, what about? Wait, there's some exceptions. But is that completely and totally going away? And I think right now it is. And so once we get our consensus on that, we'll talk about like, what does this mean for the future of Star Wars? Gio, what about you?
That's completely fair. I think that Star Wars is so broad in how it's become over the past 42, 43, 44 years that it's encompassed a lot of different character types and storytelling elements that's been borrowed from so many different areas and genres. That's kind of the myth making that George Lucas wanted to have with the Star Wars from the very beginning. And kind of fundamentally, you could just say that, Star Wars is a fantasy adventure story with some of the light sci-fi trappings of the more kind of hard sci-fi genre. I guess it comes down to literary definitions in a way and personal definitions. So we can talk about, what science fiction is or what sci-fi means to us, what the first things that sort of come up when we think of sci-fi. And those tend to be, and we can go into it a little bit more, a little later, things that are more focused on the impact of technology on society and how people are affected by emerging technologies, emerging innovations, and the impact on the individual and on the broader aspect of society. And that's the sort of thing that you've got in classic works from like Arthur C. Clarke and Philip K. Dick, and you've had adaptations of them hugely and famously and very popularly in Ridley Scott's Blade Runner. And that really looked at, how, I mean, very simply, the impact of androids and robot sentience, what that means, and brings in questions of human identity and human kind of questioning of existence. Very kind of deep philosophical questions, but they're in relation to technology specifically. And I think Star Wars varies from that because the technology isn't using our internal logic in terms of real world science. And it's not really an extrapolation of that either, as you see in things like Star Trek in its original form, in the Expanse franchise, and Star Wars is more elemental. There's one, I guess, quote that I always remember from Irvin Kershner when he was directing The Empire Strikes Back, and he was straight up asked, you know, is this a sci-fi sequel? And his response was, no, Star Wars is not science fiction. It's a fairy tale. And I think if you go back to boil it back down to the original elements in A New Hope in Star Wars, the fact that you've got the coming of age story, an adventure that's on a grander scale, you've got space wizards, you've got the supernatural element of the Force, and you have, the princess and the scoundrel, the kind of aspects that you'd get in fables and fairy tales. So not simply just hard sci-fi, as we can compare it to other franchises, whether they're film and TV or literature and books.
Kat?
I saw the young adult novel resurgence over the last decade, sci-fi oriented, and then that just ran itself into the ground because everybody was just copying each other with things like Hunger Games and Maze Runner and Insurgent. It's like if your readers caught on, it's like, okay, we're done with this. Kind of like Dan Brown reissuing the same format story over and over again until it runs that into the ground too. I haven't read in general sci-fi unless it's something like Dune or one of the older Star Wars books that they've been putting out in reprints recently. I haven't really been keeping up with that literary genre to know what's going on with it, but I haven't really heard of any big new popular series from it either. All right, the last thing I remember of something seemingly new is when there was that attempt to adapt the Aragon books that went horribly bad, but that was like, I think 2005 or 2006. And nowadays, if there are sci-fi type series or new ones, they seem to be restricted to exclusive streaming shows. Apple TV has a few of them, and Netflix kind of. So the literary side of things, I just haven't really been keeping up on it because I got a whole collection of classics over here that I have to catch up on. But I haven't heard much about it. But Star Wars is a different type of fantasy because it's more pure fantasy with just the sci-fi elements, and because it has the brand recognition, they're just going to keep cranking stuff out, which is why I wish they would just hire some like professional writers, like better writers, to just like Stephen King or somebody, like, hey, go play in the Star Wars sandbox for us, see what you come up with. That would be great. I feel it's been a long time. I mean, the new Thrawn books they're okay, they're kind of good, but I feel it's been a long time since even in Star Wars there's been something really stand out and like amazing, like in the way the original Thrawn trilogy was, which just grabbed everybody, So
I mean, there's no shortage of in stuff like that. There's no shortage of stuff that's been classic and it's stuff that's been out there for a while that hasn't gotten a film adaptation. And I think it's a really good point that maybe why this stuff isn't making it into the films and the TV shows anymore is because the literary genre, that it's not out there in that as well. So I'm just saying that look at film and TV that's happened in the past several years and think about what has come out that is science fantasy. I think the biggest thing that's done well is Avatar. Avatar, The Way of Water or whatever has hugely done well at the box office, though I think at least in some circles critically been like fan wise. I think everybody's had to go and see it, but a lot of fans that have been and that's kind of something that's leading me to it. And you got to define, how is it dead as a genre? If James Cameron can go out and make $2.9 something billion, well, maybe that's not dead, but should it be?
I think that also has a lot to do with the visual effects, because it is, the best 3D you're ever going to see, because it's native 3D and not those, the crappy post 3D conversions. And so and people, general curiosity is, why did it take 13 years, and then you see why, because doing motion capture underwater is so insanely amazing.
Yeah.
It's like,
Right.
you can't even emphasize how cool that is, even though I would say the underwater shots in that movie look too crystal clear. It's like if you're swimming even in crystal clear water, there's still going to be a slight little blur there. It looked like underwater stuff was almost no different from being above the surface, but that's just me. But I think that's part of why those movies make as much as they do, because I didn't think it did much for world building. But yeah, there's those types of things. And then we hear there's going to be a new TV series based on the Alien franchise coming to one of the streaming services, I believe. So but again, that's it's relying on brand recognition.
It's brand recognition, and I think Alien is kind of riding the line a lot between science fiction and science fantasy, and a lot of these kind of do. There
and
are
like commando type military movies or haunted house horror, so it's kind of mixed genre in that way. But yeah,
and it depends on how they go with it. Is the excuse me, Alien, I think very horror movie. Aliens kind of rode more into a science fiction / horror / military movie, which was big and popular at the time that it came out. And so things tend to ride the line. But let's go ahead and for those that are watching in there, is like, what are you considering? What are you talking about as a person? What would be science fantasy? I'll go first. I'm going to say, original trilogy Star Wars, science fantasy. Willow. I would think Avatar for sure. Other things that kind of go in that genre. I think you've gotten across the line is Harry Potter would be fantasy, is science fiction would be more along the lines of your Star Trek, which those kind of things are still doing relatively well. There's several new Star Trek series out that are well within the same vein of that genre. But what are you considering science fantasy? Maybe what are some examples, Kat?
things like The Rocketeer, The Last Starfighter. But then again, those are older titles. Maybe The Dark Crystal. I don't know, and then again, that might be more pure fantasy, but because that had a revival recently as well on Netflix.
Yeah.
But it's kind of, you see a lot of like independent sci-fi and other shows, but maybe it's just because Stargate, that especially, particularly the original Stargate, that was a great movie. So that I would put in like the realm of sci-fi, because that's more like a fantasy classic story as opposed to something like Independence Day, which is more just science fiction action.
Yeah.
But yeah, I haven't been keeping up much with the recent stuff. And then you have things like Ender's Game or Ready Player One, so other types of sci-fi fantasy mixed elements, or E.T. would technically, because E.T. I'd say would be a fantasy as opposed to just science fiction, or a mix of both because of the premise and the whole tone of it. But whereas something like, say, Jurassic Park, I would put more in just science fiction. But yeah, it's kind of tricky, and again, I haven't been keeping up on that genre. That's not particularly my favorite genre, unless if it leans more into fantasy than like Star Wars and stuff, then yes. But even the sci-fi stuff, if it's more pure sci-fi, I kind of like the concepts and reading about that more than necessarily, like Isaac Asimov does that type of stuff a lot. Or H.P. Lovecraft would do a lot of sci-fi fantasy that that doesn't, not all of it flies today, but it's still really great. I'm gonna
interrupt you, and I'm gonna stop before we get Gio's bit, because we've got a really cool comment in the chat here. Is John Chiato is going, well, from a certain point of view, from a certain perspective, are superhero movies, do they kind of fit into science fantasy? It's awesome. Magic.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I remember on the Empire of Dreams documentary, you didn't hear what the question was, but Frank Oz answered it. He's like, I don't know. George Lucas just tapped into something, and whatever it is, it must have been unique, and he knew it, because otherwise everybody be doing it. Well, Kevin Feige figured out what that was, as did the people working at DC, and it's the classic hero's journey fantasy thing. But of course, there's a lot of sci-fi elements there as well, with things like, with all the superhero movies. So yeah, that's another example of that. But I think more often than not, people think of those more as like superhero movies first, with sci-fi, kind of like Star Wars. It's fantasy with sci-fi elements.
Mhm.
Same as superhero movies. It's superhero comic book with sci-fi stuff. But yeah, that
Well,
definitely.
I'll double down on this, John, and I'll go with yes. I think that superhero movies in certain ones, certain veins, especially a lot of the Avengers and that sort of thing, have completely gone into science fantasy. But I'll double down and say, are superhero movies on the way out as well? I mean, I think it's come with a cycle, and you've started to see the newer kind of ones veer away from what is the classic science fantasy superhero movie. The Batman movie being huge into that. That's not for me in the vein of a superhero movie. They've taken a superhero movie and left turned and made it completely different. So I don't know that superhero movies being in there and part of the genre still doesn't take the question. Are they on the way out as well? Gio, it's your turn up. You're up.
There's a lot of different questions going off
I
here.
know.
It's good. It's really good. Let me just think for a sec, where to start this. I think um, the phrase science fantasy, I think is kind of, you're being a little bit cheeky there. You're kind of smashing together sci-fi, science fiction, and fantasy, which to me I still feel are quite separate. And so that's why when I started off saying that I think Star Wars in its inception was quite unique because it's a fantasy adventure story, a fairy tale, and it has sci-fi elements. But the kind of impact on the sci-fi elements on kind of real people isn't really explored at all. Definitely not in the original trilogy. Whereas I would compare that to, say, Star Trek, where that very much was a huge element of storytelling is the aspects of discovery and exploration and what that means to the characters, to the humans who are at the center of it. Um, so I think Star Wars is, there's the other term that gets used around a lot, a space opera. And that kind of idea of a kind of stripped down serialized adventure that was the inspiration for George Lucas with the kind of Flash Gordon elements that apparently were very popular in the 30s. And that was some of the material that inspired George Lucas to kind of ferment this idea of a mix of genres that kind of at the heart of it is an adventure story, but has these elements of sci-fi, but they're not the mode of storytelling. They're not the reason why Luke is drawn to adventure. They're not the reason why Han and Chewie are brought into this escape situation in A New Hope. And it's more that the kind of hard sci-fi elements I feel are very separate from Star Wars. And so where this relates to superhero movies is I think that the way the MCU is developed has been very much it's been pure fantasy, um, and origin stories of individuals that eventually lead to these big coming together team up kind of episodes in the Avengers and seeing them assemble together. And I think there's going to be an element of fatigue in that because there's only so many times you can bring in a new character and say, "Hey, here's a new origin story." I think with Marvel, and uh, I'd say I have a kind of regular understanding of a lot of the Marvel characters. I don't have an exhaustive, comprehensive knowledge of every comic book iteration of the Avengers, of Spider-Man, of the X-Men, but from where I see it, they have had elements of sci-fi as well. Um, but I think it still kind of fits more in the realm of fantasy, in the realm of kind of high adventure. Um, And I think some Marvel characters have used sci-fi elements a lot more. So the fact that some Marvel characters have their origins being as a result of freak experimentation, like the Hulk,
Mhm.
or genetic aberrations that are then used as powers with the X-Men. Um, and in Spider-Man, one thing that drew me to that character a lot was the fact that, their entire story is about the neogenic recombinator and, these experimentations with Kurt Connors and the Lizard, trying to, fuse aspects of the animal kingdom to kind of create a new kind of human. And those are almost sci-fi tropes that you get in like the Island of Dr. Moreau, going way, way back into kind of classic sci-fi genre storytelling. And so I think with some of the Marvel characters, and definitely in aspects of the MCU, you've touched on it, but they've not really been explored. But some of the underlying parts of those character stories, like with Spider-Man, the X-Men, I think there's a lot of potential sci-fi storytelling that could happen. Um, and because of that, I think the MCU has started to divert a lot since the end of Phase 3, to kind of experiment with new specific genres, and then tell slightly different stories that still vaguely fall under the umbrella of fantasy, but don't necessarily have sci-fi elements, have more um, kind of horror elements with you saw with the Doctor Strange sequel. It tried to dip its toe into that, for better or worse. You had a kind of very quirky light drama, a comedy drama with She-Hulk. You had Moon Knight, which was exploring, I guess, an aspect of mental health, mental illness, and the identity impact on an individual, but still kind of wrapped up in an adventure. So I still feel they broadly still fall under fantasy. But definitely the sci-fi elements, at least from the MCU, are being kind of sidestepped to go into more specific genres. And I I do hear your interpreting your aspect of say the Batman, because um the you know the that version of Matt Reeves as the Batman is very much looking at a hard realistic take on Bruce Wayne, and it doesn't really have any sort of fantastical elements. And I think for me, the idea of using the term superhero movie does usually bring the idea of sci-fi aspects, but I don't think they're as fundamental to some of the characters, and definitely not the DC characters as they are some of the Marvel characters. I think there's been quite a divergence in that sort of storytelling that made Marvel quite separate to DC. DC kind of tells the mythical characters, the powers of like gods and kings from ancient civilizations and cultures, or from an entirely different planetary civilization with Krypton and Superman. Whereas Marvel's had individuals that might experience kind of random sci-fi experiments gone wrong, or concepts that are more real world, and then taking that as a basis for their characters. So I think it will be interesting to see how much further they divulge as we continue, because there's definitely an
Who
element of
knows what is going to
comic book
happen
fatigue.
at all in
Yeah.
the new DC is, now that it's completely rebooted and done, except for I think the Matt Reeves stuff, I think is still on to continue. I think that hasn't gone away completely. But Catherine, what do you think?
Well, I do know on that note a couple things, is that James Gunn did say the Matt Reeves universe is safe because it's in its own separate continuity. And I do know that I think that despite DC's problems, that they're on the verge of a renaissance, because they're rebooting everything and having it. It's like we're not going to go with this kind of crazy thing. We're going to do 10-year plan. And I don't know if you guys saw it, but the other day, Jason Momoa left a meeting with James Gunn and Peter Safran, and he started streaming live on Instagram, and he was giddy as can be. He was super excited. He's like, I can't tell you what the news is yet, but I am super excited. I'm like, well, there's three possibilities. One, your Aquaman thing is extended, which I doubt, because two, you might be the DC Universe Batman, because there's going to be a different Batman for that than Robert Pattinson, which I can see him as Batman. I don't know. Thirdly, like everybody's been saying, that he might be Lobo. But it's clear that they have a plan and that they're actually happy about it. So while Marvel has been suffering for, I think, content fatigue and just way too much content, and the fact that you're now required to watch the Disney Plus shows to understand what's going on. I think that's going to cause problems. I think we might see that problem with The Mandalorian season 3, because if people didn't watch the Book of Boba Fett after hearing from others how poor it was by comparison, that they're going to be, it's like, oh, what's this? Grogu's back. What's going on? And that kind of thing. But I think DC is going to be on the verge of a renaissance. But as far as other fantasy, I mean, there's good content out there. Particularly, there's stuff, a lot of unadapted great sci-fi from the 60s and the 50s even. It's just, are they going to mine it? And the rights are out there that to be bought and treated, but they don't do it. Kind of like when another sci-fi fantasy from 11 years ago was John Carter. That was a great book series. The movie I didn't think was half bad. It just wasn't marketed very well, and it just kind of went by the wayside. But I think that could be rebooted because that was it was pretty decent. And then we've seen attempts at reboot of sci-fi fantasy of things like Conan the Barbarian, which again another Jason Momoa film that was terrible, but they still attempt to do it. I just think they need to move away from brand recognition, because if you look hard enough, you will find it. There's plenty of great sci-fi out there that's a lot more deep than just some of the more shallow type stuff that you get a lot nowadays. So
but some of the I'm still going with every time lately when science fantasy is trying to be put back into the mix, it's not going well. Avatar did not go as well as it should have. From a financial point of view, it completely and totally did. They made boatloads of money, but then again, they spent boatloads of money and it took them years. But I don't think the Willow series really did as well as it should have.
I had a feeling that I haven't finished that yet. I watched the first 3 episodes, and then the 3rd episode had that issue with the cinematography where the lighting was so dark you couldn't really see anything. Kind of like that thing that happened on the 7th season to Game of Thrones. I haven't finished it yet, but I tell you, that first episode was really hard to get through because all the main characters were so generic. It's like I always say, go back to the Star Wars model. You have the naive wannabe knight in shining armor Luke. You have the sassy princess. You got the pirate and his faithful dog, and each very clear archetypes of different characters. Whereas Willow, I mean, most of these characters are just boring 20-somethings that have been living in a castle. Like the only character I liked was the thief who joins them. Like he's fun, but and then of course Willow himself. But the rest of it was like, I'm like, this is boring. It was just kind of boring. I really don't care about this. And granted, I didn't like the first Willow movie either. I thought that was really painful. So painful, in fact, that when I watched it for the first time before one of our Thursday night watch-alongs, I'm like, I can't watch this again, even on the watch-along where I'd be making a bunch of jokes. Then afterwards, our good friend Rich Sherman, he's like, "Where were you, Kat? We needed you." But
I liked the tongue-in-cheek silliness of the original Willow. I love that.
But I think that's part of it. So you need the characters to back it up. And I admit the promos for Willow were hilarious. It was great. They're behind the scenes stuff. I'm like, wow, this is gonna be really fun. And then I watched it and it's like, okay,
Well, see, we're getting into a whole other can of worms on everything. I'm watching the second Yellowstone prequel right now, 1923, because Harrison Ford. Enough said.
Yeah.
But the other characters, other than Harrison Ford and Helen Mirren, are generic 20 some odd. I can't tell them apart. They haven't done a good enough job casting and writing to make these people different enough that I give a royal rip. I literally, like, that dude died, and I'm like, who was that dude? Was that the nephew? Was that the brother? Was that the uncle? I don't know. I don't care. If Harrison Ford dies, we riot. But other than that, I think a lot of that and a lot of shows and movies are casting people that are very. I'll go with a genre that I detest, which is my wife's favorite, the Hallmark Christmas movies, which is it not the same actor in every single one? I don't know. I don't care. But yeah, so.
Well, it's kind of like how, when you mentioned that, it's kind of how rom-coms went the way of the dodo, really, They used to be releasing like 3 or 4 of them every month, and now they only exist in the streaming world. And it's like, I mean, with a very few rare exceptions, but it's the same type of thing as the Hallmark movies. It's the same plots over and over again. The only thing they change is the setting and the cast.
Yeah.
And then
Well,
it's kind of weird how eventually people just tire of that. And I think streaming had a lot to do with it, just making much better shows and better programming that people caught on that these are kind of lame and they're not interested in them anymore. But so sci-fi fantasy, I think. Another sci-fi fantasy series I saw recently on Apple TV was C, about the.
I haven't even heard of that.
Yeah, so it's Jason Momoa, and it's like this primitive
Jason Momoa.
society. They're all blind, and the character playing Jason Momoa's son is the first person born in like forever that can actually see. And it's like this interesting tribal rivalry, and Dave Bautista leads one tribe and Jason Momoa leads the other tribe. It's pretty interesting, and it was a neat idea, but it only went for 2 seasons before getting canceled. But that was a neat sci-fi type idea. And then there's other things you find every once in a while, but that doesn't get marketed as much, and you just don't know what's out there. Or now they just did sci-fi, the premiere of The Last of Us last week, which I have never played those games, so I don't have a point of reference. But from watching it, just comparing it to other video game movie adaptations, it was very good, like very good quality show. Admittedly, I'm not really interested in the premise because I'm kind of burned out in the zombie genre, but I'll keep watching it. It's only 9 episodes. And Pedro Pascal is in it as the lead, which is cool. But that has, zombie stuff, a bit of sci-fi type elements in it.
Yeah, as I watched that as well, and I agree. I think that's a really nice one. So you're kind of leading into my next point, and I'm glad you did. So I think we're on a cycle. Things are going to cycle in and out. Is Star Wars is kind of a continuation of the cycle of science fantasy of Buck Rogers. Is you get to where you get people that really enjoyed that genre in the past who are now becoming the filmmakers, and then they make that film. George loved Buck Rogers. He tried to do that. He threw in his own mix of mythology. We've discussed that on previous episodes. And he did that. You get people who grew up in this and want to remake that. And I think Star Wars is a little bit immune to this because of how genre adaptable it is. Because new stuff, I don't think Rogue One is a science fantasy movie. I know The Mandalorian is a Western. Is how adaptable is Star Wars to go into these other genres and continue, even if science fantasy around it dies? Thoughts?
Well, in theory, it should be really adaptable because it's an entire universe that's out there. And we just need good stories and good characters to explore it. The examples that you use are some of the, I think, most resonant in terms of striking with a lot of audiences in the new era of Star Wars since Disney bought it, because they diverge from the kind of generic adventure storytelling and have a more interesting genre spin on Star Wars. The fact that Rogue One, we can get into semantics, but it's kind of like a war movie, though not quite a war movie, more an action team film, with a heist element that didn't really materialize, but at least it's something very different from the tropes and characters that are very, very generic and seen in lots of fantasy. And The Mandalorian absolutely is a Western. It is it's a sci-fi samurai story.
Western.
Yeah. So I think that Star Wars is more successful projects are the ones that go for the more diverse storytelling, and that's needed because, as you say, there are going to be these cycles through TV and film, but also audiences aren't going to be coming back to want the same story told over and over. They want something new, and that doesn't just mean new places and new characters, but it certainly helps. Less of Tatooine, the better, I say. Still, we don't need more sand planets. Let's have more diverse locations, and that's what The Mandalorian's done very well in sprinkling in new planets, new locations, and familiar ones in the sort of week-to-week stories, as well as having story elements from wider Star Wars material, like the entire history of Mandalore, the dark saber, the mystery behind the Yoda species with the child, with Grogu, bringing those back in. That's where you got the success. It's a lot of different elements of a different genre blended in an effective story way. And I think that's where maybe the MCU has started to struggle, and you can see the cracks appearing and the fatigue setting in. So there's no reason why Star Wars cannot survive the ups and downs of content and genre, even if the general sci-fi fantasy setting is looking a little dead in the water right now.
Well, but then here's I'll devil's advocate again.
Go for it.
I mentioned Mandalorian, I mentioned Rogue One because those have been success stories. But then you put Andor. Andor obviously moves away from that science fantasy, moves away from that classic Star Wars, what we've come to expect, and we loved it. We thought it was great, but the general population didn't see it, didn't watch it, didn't want it. No, that's not Star Wars. Is they?
Speaking of spaghetti western, I'm still waiting on that Good, the Bad, and the Ugly thing they teased back in 2009. They could do that.
Oh,
Nothing's stopping them. It's like, hey, if Hayden Christensen's game to come back, do it. You got him. You got Rosario Dawson. You can whoever you got playing Cad Bane, just fix the makeup a bit. Do it. You know, there's nothing, literally nothing stopping you. There's no shortage of types of, even if they're averse to adapting like literal stories they've already written. There's so much stuff you could do with Star Wars that's just, you know, kind of baffling that they're in the position that they're in right now. Because even Andor, it's like we have to tie it into Andor. I mean, the argument's been made that, you know, even though the series was named after him, he's not really so much the central character. It's more of an ensemble piece, really.
Yeah,
and so I think the first season will gain more viewership once the second season drops, and I'm pretty sure the show's going to be winning some Emmys next September, like legit, like the Emmys as well. I think that'll bring more attention to it. So
it deserves, yeah.
I think that'll pick up steam eventually, but I'm not exactly sure how many TV series are going to be tied into this overarching story from Mandalorian, Ahsoka, Book of Boba Fett. You know, the clear hint that it's going to build up to Ezra and Thrawn again. But whenever they're done with all of this, I wonder what's the next chapter going to be. Like you got to go far away, removed from, like kind of like when they announced Taika Waititi and he said he was going to do something that doesn't have any ties to the current timeline. I got excited by that, but now I have doubts whether that's even going to happen because they don't seem committed to any type of theatrical release dates, which seems insane to me. That it's like you're Lucasfilm, you've had Star Wars for all these years, and just because we don't need to rehash why sequel trilogy didn't go well, but you have all these opportunities to just, how difficult is it to make a Star Wars movie? You got Disney and their billions behind you that want to make and there's so much you could do, and they're doubling down on the whole Disney Plus thing, which is like, okay, I mean, yeah, you could do that, but I think there's a lot of ways you could adapt, like even seeking inspiration from old sci-fi. Like we've seen instances where books couldn't get directly adapted by themselves, but then they get shoehorned into other franchises. Like the fourth Pirates of the Caribbean film was based on a completely unrelated novel, and they took like 80% of it or whatever, and then just reworked it to fit their pre-existing characters. So you could do things like that and go back to really great sci-fi, like I was talking about from 50s and 60s, and just get those concepts and stuff into Star Wars. Because it is a huge sandbox that you could put a bunch of stuff into if you really wanted to. Or then sci-fi fantasy would be something similar also to Interstellar, where on the one hand, it's trying to seem like it's scientifically accurate, but then it just goes completely out the window in favor of more fantastical elements as well, because it's about, you know, the death of film, and they're trying to reiterate that with all the designs through everything. So, I mean, it's kind of hit or miss. I think The Martian was
way. There was a promise of almost like an action movie Top Gun style with potentially Rangers of the New Republic. And, you know, regardless of casting and who we thought was supposed to helm that, you could have easily just put that character out of it and kept going forward with that.
And
it didn't go.
Yeah, that definitely felt like a missed opportunity because, it's if there was a story and a plan for it, then there's no reason why you couldn't substitute a different character and have a different lead and still try and create a new story. And
Yeah.
if it was a parallel to the Mandalorian Ahsoka sort of timeline we're looking at post Return of the Jedi, it could have worked. And just your mentioning of a Top Gun style film, I mean, there was that tease of the Rogue Squadron film, which
Mhm.
has completely evaporated, and that's a fantastically established series of books that has a hardcore fan base, but
And
really
extremely
would take.
missed with how well Maverick did. That genre was the genre of the moment. That was the resurgence that people were looking for, right there. Kind of the patriotic action airplane movie, military movie. Rogue Squadron would have hit that as well. Because I mean, you've seen the things, I'm sure, the parallels that everybody is giving in Maverick and Star Wars. The
Well,
end sequence was the trench run.
well, Patty Jenkins did say that uh, they were still the reason that Rogue One sort of got shelved. One of the reasons, apparently, or Rogue Squadron, is because she was going to be committed to Wonder Woman 3. But now that that's not happening with her, they said they're still on board with Rogue Squadron. That they haven't like officially canned it completely. They're just shuffling around the release date. So it is possible that they'll go back to it. And I think you're right. I think it's precisely because of the success of Top Gun Maverick that they're going to revisit that and be like, yes, we need to do this, because people were asking after Maverick came out, oh, is there going to be a third one now? And they're like, well, we don't really know because he's off doing, the Mission Impossible sequel, the last two Mission Impossible movies. But yeah, it's and that's another thing. You could do something like Mission Impossible in Star Wars, even if Christopher Corey doesn't
I
want
was
to do
gonna
it.
say,
That would be so cool to
Yeah.
see in a Star Wars type story.
Very much. I mean, I think you can take, if someone would do it, you can take the characters and you can go to almost anything. Uh, like I said, is Rangers of the New Republic could have become it could have become a cop show. It could have become like a detective kind of thing. Is a mystery. Many things
But
that.
yeah, and even what's his name? I keep forgetting his name. Like Paul Sun Lee, the other I think that's his name, the other Ranger in season 2 of Mandalorian, who was in the trailer
Mhm.
for season 3. He could have been the lead on that show. He's great, you know.
Absolutely. And if
And
you
yeah,
wanted a name and something, here's stupid left field, is readapt and go with a proven franchise leader, is change the Fennec character and press Ming Na Wen into a New Republic Marshal. You know,
yeah,
is go ahead and make Fennec Shan that character who's an outlaw, a bounty hunter, a mercenary kind of thing. Nope, you got to turn over to the good side. Who would not watch a movie with Ming Na Wen as the lead?
yeah. But that's the thing. They don't have faith in their own ideas. Because again, even though they dumped Gina Carano, it's like, well, the concept is still a really great concept that you could do a really great show out of. And who knows, that might be something we revisit in direct response to things like, Top Gun Maverick, because you can make that a very interesting type of show because, they do fly around in their X-Wings and do all stuff like that. So you can make that something. But I mean, that's why I wonder once Dave's finished with his kind of shared Thrawn arc that he's been building up to, like, what's the next thing? Because not everything has to be connected. I mean, I understand that this particular chapter of Star Wars storytelling is,
Mm-hmm.
but as many people noted with the Solo movie, I mean, aside from some of the basic criticisms, like it seems to make the world smaller by shoehorning in the rebellion. It's like, why is this here? It's like not everything has to tie back to the first 6 movies. And so,
Well,
yeah,
and I mean, if give us our Solo 2, and that harkens for like a gangster movie. Solo 2, they got a job with Jabba.
I think that would succeed
yeah.
probably more as a limited series. I mean, I know Solo
I was
found a
gonna
lot of
say,
life on home video, but if you do want to do like a crime story and stuff like that, I think that would be suited to a good limited series if they were to do that. Or a movie too, but I don't think that's going to happen. Even Ron Howard says he hasn't heard anything other than the fans promoting it. because I can't believe we're coming up on 5 years since that movie. Wow.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I thought that I had heard that Ron Howard was dropping some hints about that, we hear you, and that there was still life to that. I think I'd pay money to see is if Ron didn't want to do it, if he gifted it to Bryce, and I
Yeah,
I
that's an
trust in
idea.
that the way that she's done here.
Yeah, her contribution to Star Wars in the streaming elements has been huge, and she's directed some fantastic episodes. So, yeah, if Ron wanted to pass the baton on, then there looks like a perfect recipient of it.
Well,
But
and because we've seen again recently that's kind of working with Ghostbusters Afterlife, is that went to Jason Reitman, and really growing up with it, and having seen that's how you do fan service right, in my opinion. Top Gun Maverick and Ghostbusters Afterlife is bringing back that long gone franchise in a familiar, respectful way.
yeah, I would add to that. I think Mad Max Fury Road really brought it home that you can resurrect a series and really modernize it and take it in a whole new direction, have it fresh, new, exciting, and give something and create a new audience, a modern audience, as well as bring in the people who've been there since the beginning. And yeah, we can only hope that Top Gun Maverick and Ghostbusters Afterlife give the confidence maybe back to Lucasfilm, if they just look sideways a little more instead of kind of looking so inwardly, and shrinking the Star Wars universe again. We want it to expand, we want it to grow, we want to have newer elements to it. And I agree, Catherine, you're saying that once this Mandalorian era arc is over, then the universe is their oyster, not just the world, the entire Star Wars galaxy. And so there's no reason why you cannot take any other genre and then just use the paintbrush of Star Wars to give it that sort of flavor, and tell new and exciting stories. Just discussing the idea of a crime drama, you could even go into something. There was that 1313 project that didn't materialize, but with the whole underworld of Coruscant, such a plethora of characters, and you could have like a crime drama set in there, or something like mafiosa, The Sopranos-esque. Even though that's a genre that isn't popular right now, there's no reason why Star Wars cannot bring it back into the public conscience.
But maybe it could be because talking about cycles and cyclical type of things, that was the genre, and that's where we were right before 1977. We're in Serpico and that sort of thing. That's where we were right before. Is that ripe to come back around?
Well, I think it'd be great if they were to do an anthology series, kind of like a Black Mirror, Twilight Zone type thing, just as a way to start vastly world building, a separate from the 6 movies, or separate from the 9 movies and all of that. See which one sticks the most, and maybe try and build something from there. Because there's no shortage of one-off great ideas. Like, you could literally do Alien in a ship or something like that, with any number of Star Wars creatures. Or imagine if you were to do a bounty hunter episode, except rather than being fun and lighthearted, you're from the perspective of the person being hunted, and it's actually scary. You're being hunted by like somebody really bad, something like that.
Tamora Morrison is the Michael Myers character.
Maybe not Michael Myers, but something kind of like that, or like I said, a one-off movie type thing, like Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, even if it's a streaming thing, and make it like an epic, or in terms of vista, find some place that has that natural beauty. Don't use the volume. Don't go to desert planets. Just go somewhere new. Like go. I would love to see, southeastern China. That would look or Thailand. Go back to Thailand like they did for Revenge of the Sith, which is only there briefly for some of the background stuff. But there's so many places Star Wars hasn't gone to on Earth that they could go to that would look, amazing.
Yeah, I think we've talked about it in other episodes, in like our what if episodes. If they gave us a what if series like Marvel did, animated or not. I'd rather see it live action, but I know that's more difficult. But if you gave us that, give us a bunch of different episodes of different genres, different types, different what ifs in the world, see which one resonates with fans and go there. Give us a spin-off series on it.
Sort of like the Galaxy of Fear book series, which was competing with Goosebumps back in the 90s. It was like a sci-fi horror fantasy element that was about these two kids and their cantankerous uncle going around exploring all these places. But in a way, it was really great world building because they were always going somewhere different. And it was always this whole new, vast expanse of the lore. And it's like, do something like that. That would be a great series. I mean,
or give us a kids movie. Give us a kids movie, a little teenager movie. We've got High Republic content.
Skeleton Crew kind of tease more towards kids.
What's that?
Is it Skeleton Crew kind of geared more towards kids? It sounds like.
We know a little. We don't know enough about it to know, but that was kind of an impression that I got.
Yeah.
So hopefully, I mean,
yeah, that'd be great. Have something, because again, Star Wars is for everybody. So just have, different. You could do things for the more older fans or the more adult fans, and then for the teenager, and then for the kids. So there's always stuff you could do. Like they got all of the, they got like Clone Wars and all of the Lego the Lego Star Wars is obviously geared for even younger for the most part, but you got that on there too. So it's like, there's nothing stopping them from building on it. Or like everybody says, just do your Darth Bane trilogy. It's like, it's right there. Personally, I would pick that before Knights of the Old Republic, because I found, because everybody knows Knights of the Old Republic from front to back. And it's like, not everybody is familiar with the Darth Bane story, at least amongst the casual fans. And I think that would land a lot better because it'd feel new to a lot of people who just weren't aware of it before. Because I bet there's a lot of casual fans who only know him from the Clone Wars episode from season 6. So that would be really cool to see. Or like when they're talking about the Acolyte, I'm not sure what time period it's set in, but that'd be neat because we really, we've seen the Jedi in their prime. We've seen the first Jedi Temple. We've seen the last Jedi. It's like, I want to see more about the Sith, but not just one-off Acolyte. I want to see more of that lore, especially, I mean, I get that Dave and John are trying to rationalize the somehow Palpatine return with the whole Grogu science project and the Snoke bats. I want to see more about Exegol. Like, I admit I wasn't crazy the way they were bringing it in, but like, if you're going to bring it in, go there, double down on it. Let's see more of that and that whole Sith type cult. That'd be really neat. Like when in Malachor, when they introduced that in Rebels, it's like, this is kind of really, it's like a super weapon or something. Like, who built this? So let's go there, or let's go to Moraband or Korriban or whatever the name is now.
Exactly.
See that in its prime, it'd be awesome.
I think that's what the part of the appeal of the Old Republic setting and the Knights of the Old Republic series is, because because of the huge element of choice in that RPG, you have the possibility of exploring the entire Sith army and Sith side of things, and the entire dark side institution, and how, especially in the second one, how the sort of power structure amongst the Sith works, and how dog eat dog it is, but also how there's like an established hierarchy. And the Acolyte could definitely delve into that, even if it just touches on it a little bit. Maybe that's gonna test the water and can sort of set up other more dark side oriented storylines. And I think Darth Bane would definitely be a lot easier than Knights of the Old Republic because there's a lot less fan baggage attached to it, and so it's also a more kind of small scale personal story revolving around a kind of singular character. And I think that's what is a good way of almost experimenting with genre. One reason why I think Andor worked really well is because you're using one character. You've got the kind of the trademark name attached to the series, but as you definitely said, it was an ensemble series, and it had a lot more going on than just what was around Andor. And there's no reason why a Darth Bane series can work in a similar capacity. And then you've got that more dark oriented, mature storytelling. And then you leave the room for something like Skeleton Crew or something lighter, something aimed at younger audiences. Honestly, I think that's why the Clone Wars is such a fantastic aspect of Star Wars, because it has elements of all of this.
Mhm.
You've got some of the dark side storytelling. You've got the entire Dathomir aspect. You've got the Night Sisters introduced. Sure, you've got a recycling of Darth Maul with Savage Press and then Maul himself, but it all makes sense from the character and stories that they're telling, as well as having these kind of lighter throwaway episodes with the droids, with Jar Jar. Sure, they didn't really hit and kind of felt like filler and might have been a little annoying when you've got a tease of Darth Maul and then you've got a droid episode. But that's just part of Star Wars, and how it shows how broad the storytelling can be and how many different genres can really fit in. So I almost wish the nature of the Clone Wars series could just be expanded upon in a streaming and film sense by Lucasfilm. Then you could have so many more interesting projects popping off beyond the
And I mean,
Skywalker saga.
I think that's what they're trying a little bit with Bad Batch is continuing that and going that. But Bad Batch has been, I think, a little bit of what you're talking about. It's been a little bit of hit and a little bit of miss. Is, you know, it's they're doing so many episodes with it. Is you get some really good ones. I won't do spoilers because we're gonna still do the watch along. But the episode that just aired was totally a filler episode. Completely didn't move the story forward, but it was a cool one. It was a nice kind of aspect of the Star Wars universe that we'd seen a little bit of before, but we could move on with. But Bad Batch has had some really good episodes, and it's had some ones that are really, really sleepy. So I think we've said we're about at that time, and I think we've done a little bit of wrapping up this topic, but we've done a lot of exploring topics that you're going to probably see us talk more about as this goes, and that's the way we like to go on this show. Is we'll give you a little bit of taste of that, and we're going to give you something else that we're going to talk about in the future, and we'll let you know about what those hits. And if you're watching this on the back end, if you're watching this on review, post in the comments. We check these, and tell us where you would like to see us go with this discussion. You know, should we discuss more about the superhero aspect of science fantasy and how that relates to Star Wars? Because a superhero movie with a Jedi, I don't think that's out of the realm of possibility that sort of thing could be done. But let us know what you want us to talk about in the future, and we'll definitely do that. I appreciate greatly those of you that were in the chat today and gave us some really cool points to make and go forth in there. I hope we got all of those. And final thoughts, everybody else. What do you think?
Yeah, good topic. Yeah, sci-fi fantasy can make a comeback, particularly in Star Wars. They just need to draw upon it. And like Gia said, stop looking so inward and look at what, outward. Not in terms of like blatantly copying what others are doing, but take inspiration from things. Hell, go into your own archives, it's there.
Yeah, the Star Wars archives are extensive, and there's a lot of written material and comic material they can use, but it doesn't have to be a one-to-one adaptation. And I think that's something superhero films can really rile the audiences up with, by saying or teasing that they're going with one specific storyline and then not really adapting it in the way that people imagined. The more new material you get, the further you are from that problem. So give us wider, bigger adventures, and keep it fresh and new. And I think Star Wars, if that's the kind of archetypal sci-fi fantasy that we think of, can definitely survive this kind of rocky period for science fantasy generally.
Absolutely. If you continue to tell stories within the Star Wars universe, and you give us good story, good content, we don't care what genre it is. We don't care if you stray away from the classic. If you give it to us correctly, done right, well written, acted, directed, and we've seen it can be done. So hope for more of it in the future, and give us more movies. We want them. So until next time, thank you very much. Join us next Sunday for an episode of the Jedi Archives. They're going to be discussing more of the High Republic comics. And tomorrow night, Monday, another watch along episode of Rebels Revisited with not only the talk of Star Wars Rebels, but completely thrown in a whole lot of Star Wars content of the weeks. Until next time, may the Force be with you.
Force be with you.
The Force be with you all.